Picture this: a small, weathered house at the edge of town, paint peeling from the siding like old memories refusing to let go. Inside, James Wilson sits alone at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid medical bills that seem to grow taller each day. His service medals gather dust on a shelf nearby, silent reminders of a time when he felt valued, when he belonged. His trembling hand reaches for the phone as he contemplates calling the VA helpline again, knowing he'll likely be met with the same automated message he's heard dozens of times before. The clock on the wall ticks loudly in the empty house, each second a reminder of how long it's been since he's had a visitor. 3 years since his discharge, 2 years since his wife left, 6 months since his last human conversation that wasn't with a cashier or a doctor. Little did he know, 20 miles away, a group of people who once trusted him with their lives were about to change everything. Let me take you back to where it all began. James wasn't always this shell of a man. Before civilian life hollowed him out, he was Staff Sergeant Wilson, respected leader of a 12-person squad in Afghanistan. His men called him Steady, a nickname earned through 3 deployments, where his calm decision-making under fire saved countless lives. When bullets flew and chaos reigned, James had a gift for slowing down time, for seeing the chess moves that would bring everyone home. Follow Steady, they'd say. He's never lost a man yet. That record held until their final mission together. The mountain village was supposed to be cleared, but intelligence failed them. The ambush came fast and brutal. James still remembers the weight of Private Rodriguez in his arms, the blood soaking through his uniform as he carried him 400 yards to the extraction point. Rodriguez survived, but lost both legs. And James brought home something invisible: the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the crushing guilt that maybe he could have seen it coming. His modest home outside Columbus, Ohio, had once felt like a sanctuary after the barren landscapes of Afghanistan. He'd spent his re-enlistment bonus on the down payment, imagining future children playing in the backyard. The neighbors had seemed friendly at first, bringing welcome baskets and thanking him for his service. Empty words that would evaporate when his true needs became apparent. In those early days after discharge, James had tried. He really had. He'd attended the reintegration programs, taken the job at the construction company, smiled at neighborhood barbecues even as the fireworks sent his heart racing. His wife Melissa had been patient at first, but gradually grew distant as the man she married disappeared into himself. The construction job didn't last. Too many loud noises, too many moments frozen in place while colleagues stared. The marriage didn't last either. What no one saw was how James would sit on his back porch late at night, staring at the stars, instinctively identifying exit routes and defensive positions, training that wouldn't shut off. What no one knew was that he'd started keeping a journal of his darkest thoughts, a desperate attempt to exorcise them from his mind. And what no one could have predicted was that Richard Thompson, the neighborhood association president, who lived 3 doors down, had taken notice of James's deteriorating property and deteriorating state with increasing disapproval. It started with a letter in James's mailbox. Formal, cold, printed on neighborhood association letterhead. "Dear resident," it began, not even using his name. "It has come to our attention that your lawn has exceeded the acceptable height of 3 inches as outlined in Community Guidelines Section 4.3. Please remedy this situation within 72 hours to avoid further action." James had stared at the letter for a full 5 minutes before crumpling it and tossing it aside. His lawnmower had broken weeks ago, and the $200 repair bill was competing with medications and utilities in a game of financial triage he couldn't win. 3 days later, he found Thompson standing at the edge of his property, taking photos with his phone. "Excuse me," James said, his voice rough from disuse. "Can I help you with something?" Thompson, a short man with an expensive haircut and perpetually pursed lips, barely glanced up. "Just documenting the continued violation. The association will be imposing fines starting today. Look, I'm having some financial difficulties right now. My lawnmower's broken and Not my problem," Thompson cut him off. "Rules are rules. They don't change because you can't manage your responsibilities." He looked James up and down, taking in his worn clothes and unshaven face. "Some of us take pride in our community." As Thompson walked away, he called over his shoulder, "Maybe if you people learned to follow structure after the military, you'd adjust better." The words hit James like physical blows. You people, as if his service, his sacrifice had made him some kind of lesser species. He stood frozen until Thompson was out of sight, then retreated into his house, locking the door behind him. The lawn violation was just the beginning. Over the next few months, James found himself the target of an escalating campaign. A citation for a broken porch light, a warning about trash cans left at the curb 12 hours after collection, a complaint about his truck, which he sometimes couldn't move for days when his back pain flared up. Each notice came with increasing fines that he couldn't possibly pay. When James tried to explain his situation at a neighborhood association meeting, Thompson allowed him exactly 2 minutes to speak before cutting him off. "While we thank you for your service," Thompson said in a tone that conveyed anything but gratitude, "the rules apply equally to everyone. If we make exceptions, where does it end?" A few residents looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one except Susan Chen, an elderly woman who lived across the street. "I think we could show some compassion here," she said quietly. "Mr. Wilson served our country. Maybe we could organize some help instead of piling on fines." Thompson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll take that under advisement." Moving on to the next agenda item. Later that week, James found Susan at his door with homemade cookies and an offer to drive him to appointments if needed. It was the first kindness he'd been shown in months, and he nearly broke down right there on the porch. "Thompson doesn't speak for all of us," she told him. "Some of us remember what sacrifice looks like." But Thompson's campaign continued. When James finally scraped together enough money to fix his lawnmower, he found a new citation. This time for unauthorized structures, because he'd set up a small memorial garden for his fallen comrade. When he applied for a hardship exemption from some of the fees, Thompson personally denied it, citing lack of sufficient evidence of need. James started avoiding his windows, afraid to see Thompson prowling around his property looking for violations. He stopped checking his mail, knowing it would only contain more fines he couldn't pay. His isolation deepened as Thompson began telling neighbors that James was unstable and potentially dangerous, phrases that spread through the community like poison. The situation reached a breaking point when James returned from a VA appointment to find a tow truck in his driveway, and Thompson supervising as they prepared to take his truck, his only means of transportation. "What the hell is this?" James demanded, his voice cracking from the strain. Thompson held up a tablet displaying a legal document. "Lien enforcement. You've accumulated over $3,000 in fines and fees. The association has the right to seize property to satisfy the debt." "That truck is all I have left," James said, a dangerous calm settling over him. "I need it to get to my medical appointments." "You should have thought of that before ignoring our notices," Thompson replied. "Besides, based on how little you leave the house, I doubt those appointments are doing much good." He glanced meaningfully at James's trembling hands. Something in James snapped, not in a violent way. The military had trained him too well for that, but in a moment of perfect clarity. He walked past Thompson, past the tow truck operator, and into his garage. Returning with a small digital camera, he began taking photos of his own, the tow truck's license plate, Thompson's smug face, the paperwork. "What do you think you're doing?" Thompson demanded. "Gathering evidence," James replied calmly. "This stops now." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Thompson's face. That night, James did something he hadn't done in over a year. He reached out for help, not to the VA or to social services, but to the people who knew him best. His old squad, the men and women who had seen him at his strongest and who understood what war had taken from him. His message was simple: "I need my battle buddies." Then, he began to document everything. Using skills honed in military intelligence, James created a detailed record of Thompson's harassment campaign. He installed inexpensive security cameras around his property, capturing Thompson's frequent inspections that always seemed to happen. When James was at appointments, he recorded Thompson's dismissive comments about veterans at community meetings. He collected testimonies from Susan and a few other sympathetic neighbors. Most importantly, he researched. He discovered that Thompson had systematically targeted other undesirables in the neighborhood: an elderly couple on fixed income, a single mother working 2 jobs, a family who didn't speak English well. The pattern was clear. Thompson used the association rules to push out anyone who didn't fit his vision of an ideal community. James also learned something Thompson didn't know: that selective enforcement of HOA rules against protected classes, including disabled veterans, like himself, violated federal housing laws. The fines, the threats, the lies about his mental state, all of it was illegal. 2 weeks after sending his message, James sat alone in his living room watching his security camera feed as 5 vehicles pulled up outside his house. From them emerged 11 people, men and women of different races and backgrounds, but with the same purposeful gait, the same watchful eyes that had once scanned distant mountains for threats. His squad, his family. Rodriguez came last, navigating the sidewalk expertly in his wheelchair. James met them at the door, standing straighter than he had in months, despite the pain in his back. "Steady," Rodriguez said with a grin that hadn't changed since they were in the sandbox together. "You look like hell." "You should see the other guy," James replied. And for the first time in years, he laughed. Inside, they formed a circle in his living room, the same formation they'd used for mission briefings. James explained the situation while his former squad listened intently. There were no interruptions, no questions about why he hadn't called sooner, just the same focused attention they'd given him when lives were on the line. "So, what's the plan, Staff Sergeant?" asked Martinez, who'd been his second in command. "Operation Neighborhood Recovery," James replied, feeling the fog of depression lift as his mind engaged with a tactical problem. "We're going to remind this community what service really means and show Thompson what happens when you target one of our own." The plan came together with military precision. Phase 1 began at dawn the next day. Shock and awe, they called it. The entire squad descended on James's property with lawn equipment, paint, lumber, and tools. Working with practiced efficiency, they transformed his yard in hours. The overgrown grass was cut, the broken steps were fixed, the peeling paint was scraped away, and fresh coats applied. The memorial garden was rebuilt, more beautiful than before. Neighbors came out to watch, first with curiosity, then with growing interest. James's squad didn't just work. They engaged, introducing themselves, explaining their connection to James, sharing stories of his leadership and courage. By midday, several neighbors had joined in, bringing food and additional supplies. Thompson arrived just as they were finishing the front yard. He stood at the edge of the property, face flushed with anger, clipboard in hand. "This work requires prior approval from the association," he began, but his voice faltered as Rodriguez wheeled up to him. "Sir," Rodriguez said with exaggerated politeness, "I believe you're mistaken. We've reviewed the bylaws thoroughly. Section 8(2) specifically exempts maintenance work that restores property to compliant condition. No prior approval needed." Thompson looked from Rodriguez to the gathering crowd of neighbors. "This isn't over," he muttered before retreating to his house. Phase 2, Hearts and Minds, began that evening with a neighborhood barbecue in James's front yard. The squad shared war stories, not of violence, but of brotherhood, of moments when they'd supported each other through impossible situations. Susan brought her famous potato salad. The Henderson family from 2 streets over brought a cake. Children played on the newly manicured lawn. "I haven't seen the neighborhood come together like this in years," Mrs. Abernathy, an original resident, told James. "Before Thompson took over the association, we used to have gatherings like this monthly." Phase 3, Tactical Response. Ying kicked into gear 3 days later at the Emergency Neighborhood Association meeting Thompson had called to address the recent disruptions. He clearly expected to reassert control, to frame James and his squad as troublemakers. What he didn't expect was for the meeting room to be filled to capacity, or for James to arrive in his dress uniform, medals displayed, flanked by his squad similarly attired, or for Rodriguez to have prepared a comprehensive presentation on the legal liabilities facing the association for Thompson's actions. Federal housing law prohibits discrimination against veterans with service-connected disabilities, Rodriguez explained to the rapt audience, scrolling through meticulously documented evidence. It also prohibits retaliation against those who request reasonable accommodations. The fines, the attempted property seizure, the defamation, all of it exposes this association to significant legal penalties. Martinez followed with projections of the potential costs to each homeowner if the association were sued. Minimum damages would be approximately $8,000 per household, he noted as worried murmurs spread through the room. Thompson tried to regain control, sputtering about rules and order, but the crowd had turned. When the vote came to remove him from the association presidency, it was nearly unanimous. The final phase, community rebuilding, unfolded over the following week. James's squad stayed, helping not just with his house, but with projects throughout the neighborhood. They fixed Mrs. Abernathy's fence. They built a ramp for the Johnsons' son who used a wheelchair. They created a community garden in the vacant lot at the end of the street. But perhaps most importantly, they connected James with support systems he'd been too proud or too defeated to access. Martinez's sister, a social worker, helped him navigate the VA bureaucracy to finally get his disability benefits approved. Campbell, who'd become an occupational therapist after her discharge, worked with him on techniques to manage his PTSD symptoms. Rodriguez introduced him to the adaptive sports program that had helped his own recovery. When James's squad finally departed, they left behind a transformed man and a transformed community. The neighborhood association, now led by Susan Chen, had created a veterans support committee dedicated to identifying and assisting current and former service members in the area. James had been unanimously appointed as its chair. Thompson had put his house up for sale the day after the association meeting. unable to face the community he'd tried to control. No one missed him. As for James, he stood on his front porch watching the last of his squad drive away. But this time there was no emptiness in their wake. His phone contained their numbers, their promise to check in weekly, their plans for a reunion in 3 months. His refrigerator held casseroles from neighbors who now greeted him by name when he walked by. His calendar showed appointments with the therapist Rodriguez had recommended, the job interview Martinez had arranged with a veteran-friendly company, the coffee date with the kindergarten teacher from 2 streets over who'd asked him to speak to her class about service. For the first time since returning home, James Wilson felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 1 year later, the changes in Oakwood Heights were remarkable to anyone who had known the neighborhood before. Community garden James had helped establish now produced enough vegetables to support a small farmer's market each Saturday. The Veterans Support Committee had expanded to 3 neighboring communities and had helped 7 former service members find housing, employment, and medical care. James's own transformation was even more profound. The job at the security consulting firm had evolved into a management position where he trained other veterans in civilian employment skills. The nightmares hadn't disappeared completely, but they no longer controlled his life. And Sarah, the kindergarten teacher, was now a regular presence in his once empty house, filling it with laughter and possibilities. Thompson had tried to establish the same control in his new neighborhood across town, but word had spread. When he began targeting a retired Marine with complaints about her holiday decorations, he found himself facing not just her resistance, but the organized support of her former unit, and an immediate cease and desist letter from a veterans legal aid organization. On the anniversary of what James now called the intervention, his squad returned for a celebration that filled the entire street. As the sun set and neighbors mingled with veterans, James found himself standing with Rodriguez at the memorial garden, now a beautiful stone installation with benches where people could sit and reflect. "You know what I learned from all this?" James said, watching children play tag across lawns that no longer had invisible property lines. "We've been trained to fight for others, for our country, for our buddies. But sometimes the hardest battle is learning to fight for yourself." Rodriguez nodded, and remembering that you never have to fight alone. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the street was quiet, James sat on his porch with Sarah's head resting on his shoulder. The stars above were the same ones he'd watched from Afghanistan, but they no longer seemed to be looking down on a stranger. He belonged here, under this sky, in this place, among these people. "Hey," he said to you. Yes, you watching this right now. I know some of you are fighting your own battles, feeling isolated just like I was. Maybe your struggle isn't with a neighborhood tyrant. Maybe it's with the VA, or a boss who doesn't understand, or just the daily struggle of feeling like a stranger in what should be your home. I'm here to tell you, reach out to your battle buddies, to support organizations, to anyone who can remind you that you're not alone. If this story touched you, hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Drop a comment below if you've experienced something similar, or if you found your own way back to belonging. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of veterans helping veterans. Remember what my squad taught me. The mission isn't over just because we came home. It just changed. Now we look out for each other here, in this new terrain. Stay steady out there.